It won't help to sort of say, as some of these language models have like a note before, it's like, oh, may include mistakes, check your work. Do not anthropomorphize, right? Like, that's not going to help, right?
Hello, everybody. We're live with Merging Minds. My guest today is Ali Hasan, Associate Professor and Chair of the Philosophy Department at the University of Iowa. He has broad interests in philosophy, including epistemology, philosophy of mind, ethical theory, and ethics of AI. He has published work in various venues, including the Journal of Philosophical Studies, Episteme, Big Data and Society, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He is currently working on a book, manuscript in epistemology, rationality, and the subject's perspective, and writing about the risks of anthropomorphizing AI. Ali is also senior advisor at BABL AI, and he and his colleagues have published work on ethical risk assessments, AI audits, and AI governance, and conducted AI assessments for companies in HR, education, and the auto industry. Welcome, Ali. Thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, and would love, I imagine that based on what I said, you have a lot on your plate. What are you currently working on, and what's most piquing your interest?
Thanks for having me. I'm currently working, and I've been working for a long time in epistemology. I'm working on a manuscript on rationality and how it's related to the first person perspective. It's in some ways a traditional work in epistemology, looking at what are different theories, competing theories of rationality, and how does rational belief relate to evidence and to what's accessible to our consciousness and awareness. But I'm also been increasingly working in ethics of AI, both in the theoretical, sort of more philosophical sphere, where I'm working on thinking about epistemic and ethical risks for use of AI in varying contexts, and more recently focusing on sort of concerns about anthropomorphizing or personifying AI, especially with the large language models and changes that we're seeing in AI. And in the more applied sort of context or practical context, I've been working with Babel AI, which is a company I've been working with since around 2018, 2019. And we sort of had an early vision before a lot of this excitement to focus on ethical risk assessments and audits of AI systems. We started doing, I think, our first assessments in around 2020, and it's really fun and interesting and exciting because I work with other philosophers, but also data scientists, computer scientists, lawyers, business people to try to help us make the world, help us sort of use AI for good, and help others who want to use AI responsibly to do that.
Interesting times for sure to be a philosopher, and interesting how, I don't know if you find it interesting, but interesting to see how all this breadth of knowledge acquires even a new dimension of usability and applicability based on latest developments with AI, and must be interesting to be in your shoes. I have a question though. Taking a step back, what is epistemology?
Good. Yeah. So epistemology is I mean, broadly, it's the study of knowledge, but I focus a lot on sort of one requirement or aspect of knowledge, which is justified belief or rational belief. So knowledge requires, in order for you to know something, it's got to be true. You've got to believe it in some sense. But those are clearly not enough. You could believe it for all sorts of bad reasons. So it seems like you need something like a rational or justified true belief for it to count as knowledge. But epistemologists broadly work on questions about, what is the nature of knowledge and rational belief, and what makes human knowledge possible, and what are some of the significant challenges to us acquiring this knowledge. A lot of my work is focused on sort of traditional skeptical problems. So there's a very difficult, thorny problem in traditional epistemology, which is that, how, one way to put the question is, how do you know that you are not dreaming right now? And presumably you can point to a lot of vivid experiences that you're having, but of course, in principle, it's possible that you have all those vivid experiences and seemingly coherent experiences and beliefs in a dream. And it's actually quite challenging to explain what it is that makes it rational for us to believe that we're awake. This is not to say that I am paranoid all the time about whether I am dreaming or not, but to say that it takes a lot of hard work to figure out, if we do indeed presumably have rational beliefs and knowledge about even ordinary common sense things, what's the basis for that? I think it clearly has something to do with what's available to our first person perspective and consciousness and our capacities of reasoning and understanding, but telling a satisfactory story that pushes against skeptical challenges, but also admits the limitations of rationality and biases and so on, is a very difficult task. And I think these concerns do sort of connect to everyday concerns as well. There are interesting questions, even within the AI sphere, about like what are sort of basic assumptions we make when we interact with other agents? Are we making some of those assumptions when we interact with AI agents or large language models or AI tools? Are there some risks and challenges there as well, epistemically? And then in the case of AI, what then are also the ethical risks and harms that might come from us sort of not using our rational capacities properly, or perhaps even our rationality in some sense being hijacked in some cases by these systems.
So, for instance, consciousness being a, per definition, subjective experience is nearly impossible to prove unless experienced, correct? Or am I wrong in that respect?
That's right. I mean, I think that's on the right track. So, if we're going to talk about, I mean, my views on epistemology are that, or on the nature of our knowledge and rational belief is such that consciousness, yes, subjective experience in some sense, what it's like for me to experience something, even what it's like for me to think through a problem. So I don't want to think of consciousness only as having sort of a domain in the sensory. It's also a lot of cognition is conscious. Some philosophers even argue, there's a huge debate about whether there's something, whether our understanding and reasoning is essentially tied to consciousness in some way. But I do think that knowledge and rational belief have an intimate connection to consciousness, and that's more difficult to tell, to spell out. And that's the project and part of the book. But what consciousness itself is, giving a philosophical account of that, of course, is very challenging, and there's no consensus in philosophy on that. And I think that has some interesting and important implications for ethics of AI, actually, and anthropomorphism that I hope we'll talk about.
So, for instance, I really want to get there, but just to dissect this a little bit further. So, from an epistemological perspective, it's if I understand correctly, it's nearly impossible for me to prove to you that I have the same level of consciousness or awareness that you do. I mean, from a proof perspective, you don't know if there's a robot behind me or what's
Sure.
piloting my brain. You're assuming that there are mechanisms that we identify with. So in that sense, there is no anthropomorphization because we are both humans. So we make that assumption that we share certain realms of experience and
Yeah.
share suffering, pain, joy, things like that.
Right.
Now,
Good. Yeah. So if I can just add something there. So yes, there's no way I can, especially if you emphasize the word proof, there's no way I can prove or know with absolute certainty that that you are conscious. I don't have any direct awareness of your consciousness. This is a sort of controversial matter, but in epistemology and philosophy of mind. But I think there is some kind of asymmetry, certainly, between my access to my own conscious states, my own experiences, my own judgments, and my access to yours, right? But
Correct.
typically, I have actually lots of reasons to think that in this case you are conscious. Now, some of this has to do with, oh wow, this is a sophisticated, apparently this sophisticated behavior that's seems to be very meaningful. What this person is saying, they aren't just, it's not gibberish. What this image is saying to me, or video, there aren't any, I can make coherent sense of what's being said. But also, of course, I have lots of background knowledge, including of myself, my own body, how I function, what I've observed in the past, such that unless I have some special reason to think something screwy is going on, right? It's very reasonable for me to think, oh yeah, you are conscious as well. You have conscious states. Maybe, and I think sometimes we philosophers can exaggerate the similarity or overlook possible differences between different people's experiences. But still, I think I have good reasons to think you are a conscious being, in part because of the sophistication of the behavior that I observe, in part because I have a kind of argument by analogy. I am, outwardly in so many ways like you, and so that adds to it as well. Let's add to that all sorts of background knowledge I have of past experiences of interacting with agents just like you, seemingly just like you. And so it seems overall, by far the best explanation of my observations is that you are a conscious being, indeed capable of understanding language and communicating in a meaningful way. Now, things change if you, maybe my position would be weaker if you take away some of those cues, or if you add more details about you or about this context that make me think, oh, wait, that explanation that I usually fall back on and is very reliable in most contexts. Oh, I have some, what philosophers sometimes call a defeater, a reason to think, oh, I shouldn't trust my assessment here. I should actually be more cautious. But in your case, even though as you started, I said, I don't have any proof, any direct observation or any strict, proof that you have conscious states, or let alone what conscious states you have. I take it I have pretty good reasons to think that you have these conscious states, and that when you communicate with me, you're actually, my understanding of your terms is at least roughly in line with how I understand these terms as well.
Yeah, I love that distinction, particularly because I think a lot of people end up getting very hung up over the idea of whether consciousness is provable or not, and not in exact how you're describing it. And the idea of having good enough indication that I am conscious and that being good enough, at least for the purposes of our conversation or our interactions or whatever we're doing. And I think but what's behind that for me is the ability to reflect on those reasons, and you outlined a lot of those reasons and the consequences of the changing in context and how that impacts how you would think about me, right? Maybe the video isn't on anymore and now I'm just a voice. You have less indication
Yeah,
of me being conscious, or maybe like you said, I add details about me being a machine and all of a sudden you're not not trusting me anymore as a human agent. But
right.
I think where that takes me is a question. Like, I mean, you're a philosopher. You've been doing this for quite a long time, and I imagine it's in your nature to question things and to wonder how things come about and to question your thought processes. That gives you a natural reflective capability over everything that's happening. So same thing you described, for instance, your process of assessing and wondering over my nature, and you can do the same thing if you're interacting with a large language model, for instance. But in my opinion, that particular skill isn't really emphasized in our educational system typically. So, in my opinion, most people are very literal as far as the things that they're presented with. This is a square, it's a square. This is a circle, it's a circle. People aren't going to question and necessarily try to understand why is this a square and why is this a circle, why is the circle not a square, and vice versa, and so on. What makes one not the other? And I think that particular skill becomes very poignant when we're in this moment where we're working with entities, things that we're not quite sure of what they are, who they are, and what. Or I am. I just committed an anthropomorphization myself by saying who. But so getting into that, like, how does all of this play? Like our lack of ability to really reflect on what we're interacting with, and also why we end up calling like making this thing into a human thing.
Yeah, good question. So I think, not philosophers are subject to this as well, at least when they're not putting their philosophical hats on. But oftentimes when we move around in the world, we rely on all sorts of background assumptions and heuristics and things that have worked for us in the past. And this applies as well to receiving information and reading things. Is people by and large generally sort of are more passive readers. They will only sort of start being critical and reflective in what they read when when something strange is said, or when they again have like some special reason to be concerned, right? And so I think one issue with I think increasing risk of anthropomorphism of AI and robots and so on today is that many of the reasons that we have to be cautious, more reflective, more questioning, are not, we're presented with like ChatGPT, for example, and all of the sort of impressive language that it presents that's very crisp and grammatical, and no surprise because it's modeled very much on the data that it's fed, which is human text. And so it in a way, this is why it functions quite well. It's picking up on complex patterns in the syntax of our ordinary language and reproducing that. And then naturally, we are going to interpret it in the ways that we interpret lots of ordinary language. And it's going to be, I think, that makes it very easy for us to slip into that. Oh, this is a news report. This is a testimony. This is, a conversation with an actual agent that's tracking the meaning of these terms, that's tracking facts in the world and assessing them. And so we can sort of let down our guard, or we can sort of just receive it as it's sort of take it at face value. And so I think that one worry is that the sorts of reasons that are reasons to be more reflective and cautious are not obvious. They're rarely presented explicitly, even for people who are aware of these concerns with interpreting these systems. It's not clear that we're going to really keep them in mind when it's important and crucial. And part of that, again, is that these systems are designed to be quite effective in mimicking human communication. Mimicry only goes so far in actually capturing what it's like to reason, to think, and so on.
Yeah, I from what I hear, what you're saying, then I completely agree. There's something disingenuous about interacting with an entity that's able to emulate a deeper degree of knowledge than it actually possesses, right? And we're being fooled by that emulation, and it's convenient too. I mean, if you ask me, I like it. It's convenient to talk to an all-knowing being. It's a mirage that I think, or a myth, something that we'd all like to have, and it's very tempting, right? To have this idea of I'm talking to basically an oracle, and I can ask it anything, and it'll get back to me, and it seems pretty accurate. And the fact that it can blend very accurate things with very inaccurate things in a very cogent way makes it much harder, in my opinion, as a reader, for instance, interacting with these things, to actually make my own analysis. And I compare that with, for instance, when I perform a search over a given thing and I read different articles, my brain is naturally predisposed to understanding that I'm not reading a single source of truth. I'm looking at multiple different sources of truth. I can see the authors. I know that they're people just like me, susceptible to making mistakes, to biases, to all kinds of things. So I have certain filters on that when I'm interacting with this entity, it's really weird or easy for me to drop that guard down and just say, it gave me the answer. Here it is. Does that make sense, or am I misunderstanding kind of the
I
direction that you're
I think
taking
to
things?
no, I think that's right. There are more subtleties that we can get into that I think are important, but I think the basic idea is right that there's a fascination with these systems and and in a way, in a sense, how well they do, right? They really are capable of what sometimes philosophers call like meaning semblant. This is Lisa Titus aptly calls it meaning semblant behavior. Right? It's behavior that's as though these systems or agents really understand and track meaning, right? Not just they mimic. It's a mimicry. Emulation maybe is a tricky word because it's like, okay, wait a minute, is that mimicry or is that actually having internal states that at some level of abstraction is similar to what a human is doing, right? There's sort of like unclarity and dangers of attributing more to the system than
So
it's
you
really
would say
there.
emulation is a step above over mimicry.
Emulation, I mean, if we mean, for example, certainly if we mean, oh, it actually is doing reasoning, it actually
Got it.
understands, it actually has conscious states. Okay, now that's definitely we're anthropomorphizing or personifying, right? But even if you say, if someone says, oh, well, maybe it's not actually understanding in the way that we think, at least, of understanding, maybe it doesn't reason, maybe it doesn't have conscious states. Even people who are not clear about understanding and representation, there's a near consensus that these systems don't have consciousness, right? And even among ordinary, like people who don't have technical knowledge, not experts, they don't know this stuff, very few, although the numbers are increasing, very few of them would actually believe that these systems are conscious. But there are all sorts of other ways that are subtle and still problematic or potentially problematic of anthropomorphizing these systems by thinking of them not merely as, oh, it mimics, it tracks these sort of linguistic patterns, it mimics our behavior so well, but starting to say, oh, it actually is has states that have meaningful content, or it actually is sensitive to or tracks our the meaning of our terms and our reasoning and inferences. And when we engage with ChatGPT, it's hard not to implicitly or explicitly actually think that, oh, I gave it this question, it responded to this problem. Even when it makes errors, right? We try to explain its errors by, oh, it's confused, it thinks this is that, and so on, right? So it's very hard for us not to, and in a way, it's at a level, it's at one level, it's rational for us to see it as, oh, maybe it's not conscious, but it's doing something like reasoning, right?
Hmm.
It's at least tracking the meaning of our terms, right? And my worry is that we're not justified in even making that somewhat more conscious statement about these systems, given
Sure.
how they seem to work. And
So
so,
we're attributing our, it's not just like in the simple idea of like, oh, we're calling it a human thing when we say it hallucinates, for instance. It's we're actually attributing our own mental states and cognitive processes. We're like laying it on to these models as if they were actually happening when we have no idea whether or not they're happening. We actually know that they're not happening. They're, like you said, they're just complex syntactical patterns, but
yeah,
they have a very different feeling.
at least that's the initial. I mean, there are ways that people will push back a little bit, we can talk about, but at least initially, that's one main concern is that even those who say, well, no, I'm not crazy. I don't think these beings are sentient or conscious or, let alone like that we should treat them with moral consideration and so on. But it's tempting, nevertheless, to think, but they track the content of our terms, the language, they have a model of the world, right? And it's not clear that that's true. It certainly doesn't follow from the fact that they mimic our behavior, right? Not only that, but the fact that they're in fact designed to mimic these syntactical patterns, right, gives us a reason to think they aren't actually following meaning. Some people might object and say, but maybe they'll develop, like just like we as young children, or parrot, young children will parrot things, and then later on they'll actually get understanding and connect the meaning to the different terms, right? And so someone might think, but maybe they nevertheless, even though we designed them for mimicry, maybe nevertheless they will develop meaning or meaningful contents or understanding. But at the very least, we're not justified in making that leap. We need some further argument, because the alternative explanation is no, they're doing this, they have this meaning semblance behavior. They're very good at mimicry because we designed them to do that, and because we gave them tons and tons and tons of data. And so, sure, maybe they have, in some sense, internal representations, but it's not clear that they have the sorts of representations that an ordinary subject engaging with ChatGPT might think that they have, right? Oh, it's tracking the meaning of this sentence. Oh, it sees that this follows from that. Like, it's not clear it's doing any of that. And so I worry in that sense that there's a kind of anthropomorphism that hasn't been as much in the discussion and attention of folks who are talking about these sorts of concerns, which is that they might not be thinking, oh, these are conscious beings, but nevertheless, there are very difficult questions about what do they represent? Do they represent things like we do? It seems like not. Maybe they represent things, but it's not clear that they have the representational systems that we do. And one concern there, a risk, is that it's going to lead to individuals interpreting and potentially relying on or thinking about these systems in ways that are as though they're more trustworthy than they are, or as though they're more dangerous than they are and more manipulative than they are. And we might even, this in turn might lead to stronger forms of anthropomorphism, especially as these AI systems get combined with different modalities, right? More audio, more visual, robots, and so on. And our emotions might also get very entangled with these systems. I should add just we might get to this later, but I should add none of this is to say that we should throw AI these systems out. I agree with what you said earlier that in some ways, like, yeah, I want an AI assistant that is easy to use, easy to talk to, that in some ways is natural and fluid. But what concern this raises is that we should think carefully about, what domains, what contexts are we using these systems in, especially in open domains and relatively unrestricted use. What are concerns with the development? What are safeguards we can put in place? How can we communicate and educate people? And how should experts talk about this?
That makes a lot of sense. And the way I understand it, this is a tool. And as any tool, it's only as good as its user, as the person who's using it. Maybe I'm also misinterpreting, but this tool is, in my opinion, mimics a lot better our behavior than previous tools that we've used. And it almost seems like our current level of education and institutions hasn't really prepared people in general to deal with something like this, because all of a sudden, if you don't ask a lot more subtle and detailed questions about what it is you're interacting with, where it's deriving its content from, understanding that content isn't knowledge, we become very susceptible, right? And I mean, that's one of the risks. And I don't know if you agree or not, but you mentioned the idea of us being passive readers, right? We don't learn typically throughout the educational process to become very active readers. I don't know if that's something even highly encouraged. I mean, we're tested for reading comprehension, not for reading abstraction, right? We're tested for, do you understand what's in that text, not do you understand what's not in there, why it's not in there, why it was said a certain way, right? So it's from a very early age, and even in collegiate level, it doesn't necessarily, obviously, obviously, if you pursue philosophy or some specific discourse analysis route, maybe, yeah. But for most part, content is taken in a passive or literal kind of sense. And I guess what makes me wonder is, I don't know if you agree, but when I look at like social media algorithms and the way they present me with information, there's already that problem. This problem has already been ongoing for a long time. If I don't question, for instance, the nature of the content that's being presented to me, why it's being presented, should I be looking at this content in the first place anyway, it's likely that that content is going to evoke in me an emotional reaction that's then going to present me even more of that content or more of that content type. And pretty soon I'll be tangled in this universe where it's going to be hard for me to like untangle myself from. Do you think this has already been happening, and do you think that the models just make the potential for this even this potentially more negative, or is this something entirely different?
So if I understand you correctly, I mean, the concern, it sounds like, is comes back to this passivity point that we're very passive, oftentimes, receivers of information. It's not to say we're not doing some reflection, essentially, as we're reading and interpreting, but we're not sort of putting on our critical hats and questioning things. And certainly, I think it's true that society, even a lot of education is not geared towards sort of training us to be more reflective and questioning and training us to be better critical reasoners. But I also think there's another practical aspect that I mean, we all have busy lives. We all want to get information, but at the end of the day, we have certain projects that we want to pursue, certain things that are important to us. And so, it doesn't make sense for me to, starting tomorrow, I'm going to be more critical about everything. Right? It's like I can't do it. I have to like be selective. I have to think about like, okay, this I'm just gonna read and take at face value. Oh, this other thing I'm not going to, right? And so naturally, it's not just, maybe there's part of the story is like we need to be better trained in order to have these abilities, and including abilities to notice when we need to reflect more carefully about something. So, and I'm agreement with you there. And I think plug in for philosophy. I'm biased, but I think philosophy is a great way to really learn those skills and hone them. But it's also kind of a practical issue, which is like we're busy people. We all have different projects. We all have, some of them are more reflective and cognitive in nature than others, but we sort of focus and selectively use those skills. And so even if we develop those abilities, we need also to, in some way, make sure they are engaged in the right contexts. And so, like, what are those contexts? And in the sphere of AI, when is it important? And how might we, as people who want to, as policymakers and educators and, consultants and so on, how do we improve society so that those risks are minimized and people are a little bit trained in certain ways, even if we can only do that in certain spheres and selectively.
That makes a lot of sense. And I personally, for instance, even though I understand that I'm using a tool and I'm interacting with a model that is non-conscious, non-living, non-breathing, non anything that's human like me, I find myself often being kind, being, maybe I'll say thank you, maybe I'll say please. And I've tried the other way around. I've tried abstracting from it, and I'm just going to treat this as a tool, and I'm going to completely um, avoid any kind of anthropomorphism because I don't want to go down that route. And then I find myself being me myself, even though maybe I'm more accurate. My actions end up being less actions that I'd like to take in general. Like maybe I'm not going to say thank you. I'm not going to say please. I'm going to be harsher. I'm going to be ruder. And then I don't like the person that I'm being, even though that has no bearing on whether or not I'm interacting with just a model or a thing.
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Yeah, that's a really, I'm glad you brought that up. So I have a couple thoughts related to that. So one is, I mean, in a way, first of all, we can notice how this is already a challenging problem, because it's not clear that the right thing for you to do is drop your thank yous and your pleases and the way, especially if that's a sort of a natural way that you interact, right? Or think even of like young children who are maybe in some educational context engaging with AI, right? In an educational setting with a teacher as a supervisor and all of that. We certainly don't want to, we might want to encourage certain habits of speech and kindness and so on, right? And so saying please and thank you, even if it's not a human that's on the other side. But on the other hand, there's concerns that that will encourage a certain kind of anthropomorphism, at least on the part of young children, maybe even adults, and maybe at least the subtle kinds or implicit kinds of anthropomorphism that I was mentioning earlier, and that might encourage even more problematic kinds of stronger forms of anthropomorphism. So there's definitely a kind of, oh gosh, what do we do here? And it relates to the point I raised earlier too, that I'm not saying we should throw, even if we find systems to be systems that actually quite strongly encourage anthropomorphism, we might not want to, we might still want to use such systems in some contexts. Some people have noted how in some health contexts, or for the elderly, end of life contexts, or when it comes to some autistic children, they've seen very positive, good results from interaction with a robot and AI. And so there again, it's like, well, in some contexts, we might want to sort of say, no, that's fine. And it may even be, all things considered, we should encourage that while minimizing certain risks. And in other contexts, maybe we want to do something different. But a second point is, in some of these cases, at least, they might be relatively superficial anthropomorphisms that don't dig deeper or don't change sort of whether we trust these systems and so on. And so and there's difficult empirical studies to be done there and to assess those things. But one thing I wanted to come back to that maybe I should have said earlier is, I use the term anthropomorphism because it's a term that's used most commonly in the literature, even as we talk about AI and large language models. But it might be helpful to distinguish anthropomorphism from personification. So if we think of anthropomorphism as applying human traits to robots, AI, what have you, things that don't, and if it's biased or inaccurate anthropomorphism, it would be applying human traits to beings that don't have these traits, right? But maybe there are persons that are not humans, or maybe there are human features like body shape, facial expression, what have you, that are not about being a person or having cognition or having consciousness. So it's worth separating those two. One interesting bit of, I saw an interview recently with Sam Altman, who is CEO of OpenAI, ChatGPT guy. And he said, yes, in response to a question, although he didn't dwell too much on risks of anthropomorphism, no surprise. He said, yes, we don't want people to interpret these systems as though, think of ChatGPT as actually thinking. But then when he goes on to say, I suggest instead thinking of these systems as sort of like an alien intelligence. And I was just like, this is problematic. You're not anthropomorphizing in the sense maybe of attaching a human property, right? But why would you think an alien intelligence wouldn't have the capacity to think, to interpret, to reason, right?
Right.
So you're yourself just fallen into this sort of trap of, of course we're not thinking about it as conscious and as thinking in the way that we do. But here you are saying, oh, maybe it's like an alien intelligence.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. That trap is exactly what I feel, that like I can't help but having to make some kind of decision. Do I treat it as somewhat similar to me, as a machine? And because we're talking about my own speech patterns, that decision will even impact the way I relate to other similar speech patterns. That's my challenge. Like I can't compartmentalize, at least my brain. I can't compartmentalize and say no. I'm never gonna say please and thank you to this specific speech pattern coming from this specific
Right.
machine. But then when it comes from a different source, now I'll be kind. Now I'll activate kindness. I can't do that, and maybe other people can. But I think that's part of the challenge. Is we're not, at least I'm not built to be able to interact with something that's so uncannily mimicking human speech patterns, and yet constantly remind myself that it's not
Yeah.
really doing any of those things. It's like beyond, like I can understand, obviously from our conversation I'm in conceptual complete agreement with you, but I know that when I get down to practice, I'm not going to be able to sustain that level of inquiry, particularly in the case that you described, the practicality of that and the cost that it that is entailed in running that level of questioning. It's just unfeasible. I need to
Yeah.
get stuff done, and in getting to get stuff done, I'm going to activate my own heuristic devices, and I'm just going to start interacting with this thing, if not as if it were me, or I'm going to understand that it's something, and
Right.
that it is putting together. Maybe it's not thoughts, but patterns, but it's going to be something similar. Do you think
Yeah.
is there a way out of this, like, of this
So I
trap?
mean, so I don't think that it's. I think I'm echoing what you just said, and that I don't think it's feasible for us to like, you know, turn off our ability to read these responses that we get, for example, from ChatGPT, but read them as though it's just, you know, a string of symbols that are produced in line with this large language model that just tracks these statistical things. It would make it, you know, part of the reason why it's such a powerful and useful tool is that we don't have to do that, or we don't have to. There are other there are other AI systems that don't have that kind of user-friendly, human-like language. Scientists have worked with all sorts of very sophisticated AI systems in relatively restricted domains, and they work very well there, and there isn't that sort of concern. Um, and I don't see that, especially as these get more and more sophisticated, it doesn't make sense for us to always be sort of like, you know, in some ways interpreting the language in a different way, or which we can't really do, or really reflectively always questioning. It has to be in some ways something about something else. I'm not sure exactly what, but something about how do we improve or change our assessment of these systems overall, of their overall reliability and trustworthiness, in ways that still allow us to engage with them in very fruitful ways and make use of them. The challenge is that in cases where the use is relatively open domain, unrestricted, right? We don't necessarily have a very strong assurance that people will keep in mind the lessons. But I mean, maybe it helps to sort of, it's just a, in some ways, misleading analogy, but I, people can be, con artists and bullshitters can be very seemingly trustworthy, very good at giving you all sorts of information. But once we internalize or get the right sort of get like understand like, oh, this is what's happening in this case. That's it. I'm not trusting this person. And then we sort of, when at least that kind of distrust reaches a certain level, we become more cautious in general, at least with respect to what we will do when we respond. But the extra challenge in the case of AI, I think, is that it's not a bullshitter either. It's, you know, in some ways, it's not trying to manipulate me, and I know that, or you know, I might not have any good reasons to think that it's trying to deceive me or manipulate me or anything like that. And then it gets, I think, challenging to think of like, okay, well, what do we do to try to improve the problem? And I think more work needs to be done here, but that's why I think it's not as simple as, it won't help to sort of say, you know, as some of these language models have like a note before, it's like, oh, may include mistakes, check your work. Do not anthropomorphize, right? Like that's not going to help, right? So it needs, in some way, there needs to be more thinking about what kind of education, what kind of framing, and what kind of regulation needs to be in place to protect people from some of these risks.
I really appreciate our conversation, Ali. I think this is all fascinating stuff and got me. I think as any good conversation gave me a lot more questions than answers, things to think about. I really appreciate all of the insight that you provided me and our audience. And if people are interested in getting to know more about you and your work, where should people go to?
Yeah, thanks. Well, a couple places. One is if you go to Phil Papers or Phil People online, philpapers.org or philpeople.org, and search for Ali Hasan, you'll see my articles up there. There should also be a link there to my department website. The other place you can go and look if you're interested is go to Babel AI. I think babelai.com is the homepage, but you can just search Babel AI and you can see some of the work that our company has done on this front.
Very cool. Well, I'm a big fan already, and thank you so much for all the insight and knowledge. Really appreciate our conversation.
Thanks for
And
having me.
thank you, everybody, for watching. This is us signing out of Merging Minds. Thank you. Till next time.